Good morning. So what we're going to be doing is adding part of our developer kit for this app. So we have a couple different pieces for developers. We have an Alley Chat web API. We have a client application section where you can register your own client apps with one of 4 different authorization types. So that way you can retrieve a token to use it on the web API. We have a My Web APIs section so that you can register your own web API and use the LHChat identity system if you want. And then also an SDK, which includes a client services class in .NET that would work on Xamarin as well as on console or WPF apps. And it will allow you to get tokens for each of the auth types except for implicit. And then also it has a WebSocket and a TCP socket plugin with that. And then the final piece is going to be documentation on how to retrieve a token. Okay. So when we look at the server here in my domain library under entities, I have something here called a application user connection. So we're going to copy this, and what I want to do is make one here for the API resource. Like that, which is called a API resource. And this is going to be if I look at my SQL Server, this first one here is a ID. So we're going to say that this is a resource ID. Okay. That should be it for the entity, except on the application user, I need to have these as a application user API resource. Like that. And then we need to add one of these as a DTO here. Call this a API resource DTO. Application user API resource DTO. And this was called a resource ID. And then we need to have one as a VM in here called a application user API resource VM, which is a application user API resource VM, and a resource ID. Finally, we need to have one of these as a request right here. And I'm going to rename this one application user API resource create request. And all this one's going to have on it is a resource ID and my application user API resource create request. Okay. Now that those are done, we want to add this onto my data access layer auto map. And in here we need to have it with my application user stuff. So this one, and we'll copy this and change these things into a API resource. And then a API resource, API resource, and API resource. Okay. So now that that's done, we need to, in my services, web API services, we have a iServices web API, and right here, I'm going to copy and paste these again and we're going to make these a application user API resource, and we'll change that in the selection. Okay, so now when we look at this, we are reading them all by an user ID, which is right. We have a read for just one. We have this request here, so that's fine. That's fine. And then I delete, and that looks good. So over in my services, I can implement that right here. And we're going to do that same search and replace here. And then for the lowercase as well. Okay, so now when I look at this one, we're going to get my application user, and we want to look at this one, and we need to add in here the API resource called API resources. Like that. And we just want to get all of them where they are equal to that ID. And then we're going to set it to the DTO, map it, and return them. Okay, same thing here. Application user web API. Okay, this one, we're getting my user, and then we're mapping across my request to the resource and setting the ID. And then we need to add it to the correct table, and then we're going to do the read. And then finally, we have the delete, which is this table. And we're going to set it to modified and that it's inactive, and we'll save it. Okay? That looks pretty good. The next thing that we want to do is if I look at my Web API Hub, where I'm doing my create RO password here, this is inside of Services Identity Server. And this is where we're actually creating everything. So this looks right. So in here we want to have a new function called a public asynchronous task called read API resources asynchronous of a GUID application user ID. And then we're going to have a public asynchronous task of a read API resource asynchronous of a GUID application user ID and an ID. And then we're going to want to have a public asynchronous task called a create API resource asynchronous. And then we're going to want to have a public asynchronous task called delete API resource asynchronous, which is a GUID ID and a GUID application user ID. And this one's going to have on it a API resource create request called request and a GUID for my application user ID. And now, for my API resources, if I look at my library here, we don't have entities for these, we just have models. So if I look in the library for DTOs underneath client applications, I have code auth, I have a regular DTO, I have a implicit, an RO password, a PKCE DTO, and we're going to add one in here for a API resource DTO. And this is an API resource DTO from a base DTO. So if I look at this, let's finish these up real quick. If I look at my identity server config, I see that an API resource has a number of these. Well, it's got a name and a display name. And then it's going to have an array of the number of scopes. And each scope okay. So now we're going to have a string here of a number of scopes. And then also I want to have a string which doesn't need to be there called a API secret. Secrets, like that. Okay. So close that one up. We're going to copy this thing into my VM and change this to be a VMs. Okay, that looks right. And then we're going to copy this one more time into the create request. Right here. Client API resource create request. And this is an API resource create request, which is a base request. And on this, we also want to have a public int called a ID. We also want this ID to be on the DTOs and the view models. We could do it like this. So that we override it. Okay. So now that you have these ready, we can go to the data access layer and add them in here. Under your client applications here. And we're going to have a client it's called a client application will get changed to be a API resource. Hey, Sick Mofo, welcome to the channel. How are you? So these ones. Like that. And now we have both sides of those ready to rock. So in my API resources here, under your services for identity server, I want to add in here a task of a API resource DTO. called read API resources asynchronous of my GUID application user ID. And then I'm going to want to have one for just one, which is a VM. And then I'm going to want to have one for a create API resource asynchronous with a API resource create request. And then we're going to have one with a bool, which is a delete. Now the thing about these API resources is that just a second. What functionality is I'm working on the developer packages. So I'm making it so you can add your own APIs as well as your own client applications to the app. So when I look here, for example, this looks like these need to be updated, so we'll do that as well. So the first thing is my read API resources. So I want to say a using var context equals new, and my context is a Ali chat identity context. And what I want to do here is I want to get my API resources, which we're going to call entities, equals await my context of the API resources. And we want to include, well, no, we don't want to include anything with this. And I want to say a where my s.application user, where my. So before we do this, I want to do my var application user API resources equals await services dot read application user API resources of my application user ID. In this one, we want to do a for each application user API resource and a application user API resources. I want to get my entity where it's my first or default asynchronous where my ID is equal to my application user resource dot resource ID. And up here we're going to have a new list of DTOs equals new list of API resource DTO. And then we're going to do a if my entity does not equal to null, then we're going to do a entity, I guess it's going to be a DTOs dot add a new one of these where my name here is the entity dot name, the display name is the entity dot display name, the ID is the entity dot ID, the scopes is the entity dot scopes dot select, and we want to select the name. Dot to array. And the API secrets, which is my entity dot API secrets, and we want to select the value dot to array. And so now we want to here include my API scopes, and then also the scopes, API scopes. Then finally, we're going to do a return DTOs.toArray. And we want to add this as a array of DTOs. And that should be it. Okay, the next one is similar. So we'll grab it here. And I want to first read application user resource ID of the ID and the application user. And I want to say if application user API resource does not equal to null, then we're going to do all this. And we're going to get my entity here, which is a API resources where my API resource ID equals there. And then here we're going to do a return this new VM, which is here. And otherwise, we just want to return null. Okay. The next one is the create, which is going to be another VM here. And for this one, what I want to do is first I want to try to get my resource from my request.id. Hold on, it's got to go the other direction. Just a second. One of the things I wanted to do was over on my data context, I need to add the unique identifier here on this one. So this is a API resource, has a resource ID, which is unique. Because you're having a translation issue here. So the first thing you want to do is just get this one. If I look at this, I feel like you need a second one. Because when you're doing your create, you're saying your client ID is a string, but this actually has a ID that it's passing, which we need to check to make sure that it doesn't exist yet. Okay, so in here, the first thing I want to do is do a using var context equals new alley chat identity context. And I want to say var API resource equals await context dot API resources dot first or default asynchronous where my, and if I look at this API resource in the database, can I make this thing annullable? Okay, which means that also on the view model and the DTO, that should be nullable. Okay, so now we're going to get the if my request dot ID dot has value and your request dot ID dot value is greater than 0, then we can do this one. And this is going to be this is an update. And then we want to say else this is a create. Okay, so in your update, you first want to get the API resource for that user. So if I look at this one, we'll make a new one of these, which is a integer for the ID. And we'll say that this is called a resource ID. API resource ID. So now here we can do a var application user API resource equals await my services dot read API user resource of my request dot ID and my application user ID. And this needs to be a dot value. So if this is not equal to null, then, because that means now we already have this, this resource belongs to this user. And then what I want to do is I want to say a application, I want to get my var API resource equals await my context.api resources dot include the scopes and include the secrets. And I want to do a first or default asynchronous where my ID is equal to my request.id.value. If my API resource does not equal to null, then I want to do API resource dot, and I want to say API scopes secrets dot clear, API resource dot API scopes dot clear, and then I want to do API resource dot name equals my request dot name. You have your API resource dot display name is equal to the request dot display name. We have the API resource dot what's the next thing that we have in here? Scopes and API secrets. So for each scope, var scope in my request dot scopes, I first want to try to get the scope. Hold on. If I look here at my API resource scopes, we only have this one. So what I want to do here is I need to select my scope. I want to say var existing scope is equal to await my context dot scopes dot first or default asynchronous where my name is equal to my scope. If my existing scope, then we want to do a API resource dot API scopes dot add existing scope. And if not, I want to do a existing scope equals a new API scope. And here what I'm going to do is one of these. Okay, and in my API scope I have a API resource equals API resource ID equals API resource.id. My description, I don't care. My display name equals scope. Showing discovery document is false. The name here is scope. And nothing else. And at that point, then you're going to add this onto your API scopes. The last one is you need your secret. For each var secret and request.client secrets, API secrets, I'm going to do a API resource.API secrets.add a new secret. And I can pass in here a value of the secret dot to SHA. It's just SHA 256. This is a new API secrets. Which is the API resource equals API resource ID equals API resource ID. The value here is the secret dot SHA 256. And after all of that, now I want to say context.API resource, it's context.entry of my API resource.state is equal to entity.modified. Okay. And then what I want to do is if my await context.save changes asynchronous is greater than 0, then I want to do this equals my await services.create application user API resource, which is going to be a new request, which is a resource ID equals my API resource.id and a application user ID. And this is going to be called the application user API resource VM. And then I want to do and now I want to do a return await read API resource asynchronous. When I look at this implementation, we have two of these, one like this and one like this, for a integer called a resource ID. And you want to get the one where your resource ID equals resource ID. And we'll want to do the same thing up on this one as a integer for my client application ID. We'll just call this a client ID. And then up here, we want to add that one in right here as an integer client ID. And you want this to be a API resource .id and a application user ID. Okay, for the create, it's close to the same. So here, if you are now going to create a new API resource, so we'll do a var API resource equals a new API resource. And in this, I could say the display name equals request.displayName, the name equals request.name. And then for each one of the scopes, we're going to try to add this. Like that. You're going to add the scopes. You're going to add the secrets. You'll set it to modified. You'll save it. This should be by, we should have one more of these for the integer. Okay. Like that. So the only difference between these two is that you want to say this is an API resource called API resource equals null. And then if it has it, it's going to get a new API resource as a null. Like that. And then we're going to drop this one out and we'll do an else here. And otherwise we're going to create it. And then here we're going to say that my context.entry of my API resource.state is equal to modified. And then this one we want to say context.API resources.add this API resource. So if this does not equal to null, then what we can do is do a create on this, because the create shouldn't matter if it's a create or an update. Okay, so here, if I look at this ID, I want to add on here a GUID. No, just like that. And I want to say that when we're doing this create, I want to see if this is an update or a create. So I want to do a context.application user API resources where my, and I want to get the first or default asynchronous where the application user ID equals application user ID, and the resource ID is equal to my request.resource ID, and it's active. Like that. No active flag. And we're going to say that this is my var existing API resource. And if my existing API resource is not equal to null, then we're going to do this is an update. Otherwise, this is a create. And then we're going to add this one here, like that. And then here's our return. So now in this case, I want to do entity dot active equals true. Entity.timestamp equals datetime.now. And we want to do a context.entry of my entity.state is equal to modify. Okay, when I look at these other creates up here, this one, this time here, we want to do a we want to say var entity equals await my context dot, and it's going to be your application user client applications. And you want to get the first or default asynchronous where the ID is equal to request.client ID, and the application user ID equals application user ID. So if my entity does not equal to null, then we're going to do a this is an update. Otherwise, this is a create. Here it's going to be entity.active. Okay, and when I look in this one, we want to have a new integer called like that. This is going to be s.active equals true, and then we'll do a entity.timestamp equals date time.utc now, and then we'll do a context.entry of my entity.state equals modified. Hey there, Fallen Hope. How are you doing, man? How are you doing? Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. It's good to have you back with us. How goes it, Pierre? That looks good. Both of those are looking much better now. Okay, so now when I go back to here, that looks good for the create. And down here we want to do a return null. The last one is this delete. So the first thing I want to do is a var API resource. Let's just, resource equals await read API resource asynchronous of my ID application user ID. And then I want to say if API resource does not equal to null. Now I want to say API resource. I want to do a using a var context equals new Ali chat identity context. I want to say my var entity equals await context dot API resources dot first or default asynchronous, where my ID is equal to my API resource dot ID dot value. Now I want to say if my entity does not equal to null, then I want to do a context dot API resources dot remove my entity. And now if my await context dot save changes asynchronous is greater than 0, then I want to do a return await services dot delete application user API resource of my ID and my application user ID. And on this one we're going to return a boolean. And down here we'll do a return false. I'm making the SDK right now. So that's all done. Here's our read client applications. That looks fine. Here it is for implicit. That looks fine. Here it is for the create. Now we'll get rid of this. We'll put this here like that. And now what I need to do is I want to first get my request here. Should have a prop integer array called ID. because here we're going to say if request.id.hasValue and request.id.value is greater than 0, we're going to say this is an update. Otherwise, this is a create. So in this, we need to bring up my client into the create. And we want to say client equals null. And otherwise, I want to do a client equals await my context dot clients dot first or default asynchronous, where my ID is equal to my request dot ID dot value. If my client does not equal to null, then here I want to do client dot enabled equals true, client dot allow tokens via browser equals request dot allow tokens, the enable local login equals request dot enable local login. My client dot client ID is equal to my request dot client ID. My client dot client name is equal to request dot client name, and my client dot client URI is equal to my request dot client URI. And then what I want to do is I want to say client dot redirect URIs dot clear. We're going to add them all. And then same thing with the post logout redirect URLs. The same thing with the core's origins. You're adding the implicit grant type. And then you're adding your new scopes. This is wrong. You want to say that your client scopes here are a for each var scope in request.scopes. So up here we want to add in on this thing a number of scopes. And then I want to say client scopes dot add new scope, where my client ID equals client dot ID, my client equals client, and my scope equals scope. And then we're going to set the OIDC for the protocol type, and that should do it. And then we'll save it. And then we'll create the client application. Okay? So the next one was hybrid, which we're going to rename this to be code authorization. And that looks right. Here's the next create. Create client application code authorization asynchronous. So we don't have this. We're going to say if my application user does not equal to null. Then we're going to have a new client client equals null, and it's plural. And here I want to say if my request dot ID dot has value and my request dot ID dot value is greater than 0, then we have a this is an update, else this is a create. So we'll put this here as a create. And then as the update, hey there, Yuval Line. How are you doing? Welcome to the channel. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to pop them into the chat. Thank you so much for the support. Let's go ahead and get my client here. And now this time we're going to look at my request, and it's got a few things on it. Front channel logout. Equals front channel logout. And then the other ones are fine. And now here you want to do a client dot and we want to say that this is my redirect URLs dot clear, my client dot post logout dot clear, my client dot secrets dot clear, my client dot allowed cores origins dot clear. And up here we need to make sure that we include my redirect URLs, my post logout URLs, my secrets, and the cores origins. We need to do the same thing up on this one, which is we need to include the redirect URLs, the post logout URLs, and the cores options. And then for each one of my redirects, we're going to create it. For each one of my post logout URIs, we're going to create it. For each one of my secrets, we're going to create it and SHA it. For each cores origin, we'll create it. Here's my grant type of hybrid. And now if I look at my client grant types, authorization code, password, implicit. So we'll say this is authorization code. Authorization code. And then my scopes, we're just going to use this one. And then we'll set the protocol and do that. Okay, that one's done. The next one is this RO password. The same thing is like this. If my application user does not equal to null, now we're going to have a client called clients equals null And if my request.id.hasValue and my request.id.value is greater than 0, this is going to be a this is on update, else this is a create. So we'll move this to the create. And this to the update here. So this is going to be a client equals await context dot clients dot first or default asynchronous where my ID is equal to request dot value dot ID. And now if my client does not equal to null, then we're going to update it. Okay, in this one we have CORS origins, so we need to include here my CORS origins, the grant types. Second. When you looked at this, you also wanted to include your grant types. So client.grantTypes.clear. Redirect, post logout, client ORs or CORS, grant types, and scopes. Okay, the next one here is redirect, post logout, secrets, CORS, grants, and scopes. Okay, and then we also want to add secrets onto this one so that we're making sure we clear all the secrets if there were any on this. Okay. So we're on this one. Like that. Where did all of my things go? There. Strange. Okay. So we added secrets up on this one, right? Yeah. So let's bring these all in. And we're going to say client equals all of this stuff. And if it's going to be the case, then we want the resource owner password request. Which has none of these. And you need to make sure that you have a context.entry of my client.state equals modified. Let's make sure we have that on the other two. Okay. And now what we want to do is we need to clear all of these. So I can just use this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like this. Here's my CORS origins. Here it is for password. Here it is for client scopes. we can just copy that. We have set our protocol, and then here we're going to create the client and return it. Okay. So now we only have a couple more of these we need to do. Let's bring these up into the interface. We already did, so we need to also have one more set here for native PKCE. Okay. And this needs to be PKCE for these. Okay. So now when I look at this, we can use this one as the guide. We can use this one as the guide. And I'm going to change this to be PKCE, which is our native flow. And then this one, we want this to be PKCE. Looks like you're going to have some problems here with these reads. This one is mapping my client grants, client scopes, client cores origins, client redirect, client post redirect. Okay, this one here is mapping types, grants, post logout URLs, client redirect URLs, and client secrets. This one is reading client grants, client scopes, secrets and cores origins. Okay, this one's PKCE. The VM says it just has redirect URLs and post logout redirect URLs, so it doesn't have these two. And we want to add in here include the redirect URLs and the post logout redirect URLs. And this is our last one, our create. So this needs to be a PKCE request. And this is a PKCE asynchronous, right? Or yeah. And this needs to return a PKCE VM. And we're going to return everything here. And this time on my client, on my request, it's just 2 arrays, so we can get rid of this. We're going to clear everything. Make my post redirect URLs. No client secrets. No cores origins. It is authorization code. Our client scopes are good. And then read client PKCE asynchronous. Now we have just a couple more things to do, which is that in my identity server under config, I already have a lot of the properties set up for these. So what I mean by that is down here, if I look at my resource owner, password, create, when I'm doing all of this, I want to say my allowed grant types I want to say is equal to my grant types dot resource owner password. All right, whatever. That's fine. And then we want to say that these are allowed scopes. That's fine. Client core's origins are good. We have allow offline access. So let's add that onto this one as a prop boolean allow offline access, and then also a prop bool called require consent. So in your create here, we can say client dot require consent equals request dot require consent. And I want to say client dot PKCE is false. And I want to say client dot allow offline access equals request dot allow offline access. Okay, in the create here, we want to have the same thing. And then same thing here. And then the same thing for create RO password. And then your create PKCE. When we do this one, we want to say true. Okay. So that's done. We have the allowed scopes. We have our core's origins. That looks good. For auth code, we have our secrets being defined. That looks right. For your native flow, we've set it to code. PKCE with a required consent. I think that that's it. and we'll rebuild this. These want to be called native PKCE. Okay? Okay, so this needs additional information for it, so we'll just comment these out for now. This is a test app. And then everything else looks good. So now, when I look back at my hub, I should have these functions in here called request client implicit, create client implicit, request client RO password, request application RO password. This one is code auth. This one is code auth. This one is PKCE. And we want to look at these functions here. We're going to change this one to be code auth, and this one to be code auth. We can change this one to be PKCE. This is PKCE get, and this one we're going to get a native PKCE. We're going to read that. And if I look at this one, this is going to be a receive client application code auth, create client application code auth, and don't you also want to do a await request client application code auth of your client application.id? This one is PKCE. Create application PKCE. So let me look at these one more time as I step through them. This create needs to have a await request client application implicit. And this should now be a int for the client ID. Like that. And then the same thing with this one. Of my client application.id. The next one is this one, which is a integer for the client ID. And the last one is this one, which is an integer called create client application PKCE. And then you want to do an await request client application PKCE of my client application.id. Okay, let's fix our errors that we have. This is client ID now. And then client ID and client ID and client ID. And then if I look at the interface for this, these all need to be integers. And then if I look at my implementation, we'll change all these to be integers and call this client ID, which is going to just fire just a few errors because this is now client ID. And this one is now client ID. And that should do it. Let that build. On our web hub, we need to also have our, we'll use this one here as a template. And we're going to change the word here called command set to be API resource. Same thing with that one. And then also the plural. Okay. So this is going to be request API resources, which doesn't have anything. And if I look at this, we want to do a, we already have them. So this is a API resources get. And this is going to be an API resources called read API resources, plural, from my application user ID, and then I receive API resources of these. Okay, the next one is request API resource, which is an API resource get, and read API resource asynchronous of my integer, which is an ID. Receive API resource. Okay, this one is an API resource request called create API resource. And you're just going to do a API resource create request. you're using the services identity server for this. So you're using the wrong context here. This is services identity server, read API resources. This one is read API resource. Which is an integer. Okay. So this is the request, receive API resource. Then you have the create here, which is your services identity server called create API resource asynchronous, which is a create API resource, and then request API resource of your ID. Like that. And then the last one is remove API resource, which is an integer. And this is my services identity service. And we want to do a remove API resource. Like that. Then we're going to do delete it. And then we're going to do a request API resources of my nothing. And when we look at your remove client application, this is right. We want this to be an integer called client ID. And this is an integer here called client ID, as is this one called resource ID. And then when I look at this one, we want these to be integers for both of them. Like that. And now that looks good. We're almost done. This one here is a integer and a integer called client ID and resource ID. Okay, it says this doesn't implement something, but that's not accurate. It does. This one says that client ID needs to be here. And then when we rebuild it one final time, we need to finish up this little bit where we have our two delete functions, which are integer resource ID and integer client ID. So this is where your client ID and your resource ID. And we can rebuild it. Okay, it says that this interface doesn't have the right because you deleted the other ones. So you wanted to add this back in and have this as a GUID ID. And then we'll say ID equals ID. And then the same thing on this one. And we'll rebuild it. Wait for it to finish building. It's done. Everything succeeded. So now we're going to set my web API as the startup project. I'll do a add migration on my code first here. And we're going to say added API resources and corrected client applications backend. And we'll deploy that. Now I'll do an update database. Okay. And so now that that's all done, we can start up all my projects. And now the back end is completed for our clients and API resources for the software developers. This here is a test app that will test 3 different auth types, and then it'll try to do a introspective on it. So all that's working. So let me go into source tree here, and I'm going to say we're going to stage everything and call this AC23, and my time is 1 hour and 35 minutes, and my comment is added API resources and corrected client applications, including PKCE, requires testing. And we'll give that a commit and push it out. I had to take a break. I'll be back in 12 minutes. If you have any questions, great time to put them in the chat. Also, make sure you check us out at Discord, discord.pixelhorrorstudios.com, and I put all these videos up at youtube.pixelhorrorstudios.com. See you guys in just a couple of minutes.